There are many subcategories of jazz music. There's contemporary, bebop, Latin, ragtime, smooth, and fusion. Sounds from the saxophone, trumpet, trombone, and piano are key instruments in jazz music. Jazz music is closely tied to African American culture and has influenced many genres of music. Jazz originated in New Orleans, and the blues originated in Mississippi. The popularity of jazz, which was driven by racial and political tensions between African Americans and everyone else. Jazz was constructed in a way that many white musicians failed to understand. The first style of jazz, called bebop, was used as a form of rebellion and did not conform to traditional musical styles. Nightclubs like the Con Club opened for the intent to sell illegal alcohol. While the waiters were black, the customers were white. Harlem's black residents were not allowed to sit in the audience, and in most cases, they could not afford it. Along with black musicians, black women of lighter complexion performed for the audience. Black musicians would often host parties in their apartments and sell food to make more money than the peanuts they were given in the nightclubs. Black musicians felt that they should control their own establishments, working hours, and how much they got paid. The biggest challenge for musicians was getting their music heard to a majority of white listeners. However, musicians like Louis Armstrong, Bessie Williams, and John Coltrane were influential individuals that not only brought black and whites together, but also to expose an unjust society through their music.
The Harlem Renaissance consisted of different arts like art, music, and literature. Many writers made movements through writing in connection to the civil rights activism of the time. Some literary artists of the time were Langston Hughes and Dorothy Ress. They brought a way for African Americans to be creative through writing about their experiences. Other artists that I noticed were Zora Neale Hurston and Claude McKay, which we will go into depth in the next clip. Zora Neale Hurston was one of the many great writers of her time that represented black women. She was born on January 7th, 1891 in Alabama. She got an education at many different universities, but one included Columbia University. She got many awards. One was the Anisfield Wolf Book Award for nonfiction writers. She was also known as an American folklorist and writer. She made collaborations in 1930 with the famous Langston Hughes on a play, which never got finished. One of her first published book in 1934 was called Jonah's Gourdvine, which portrayed the African American lifestyle and the mistreatment of African Americans of that time. In 1942, she made an autobiography called Dust Tracks on a Road. This autobiography was very famous and helped her in her endeavors as a writer. Her most known book is called Their Eyes Were Watching God. She, unfortunately, as her time went on, she struggled financially as a writer, being that writers typically don't get paid a lot, especially being African American. She struggled with that financially and personally. Unfortunately, she died on January 28th, 1960. Another well-known writer in the literary world of the Harlem Renaissance was Claude McKay. Claude McKay was born September 15th, 1889 in Jamaica. He had many different education endeavors, but one included Tuskegee University. He was mostly known as a poet, but also practiced prose and letters as well. One of his famous sonnets he wrote in 1912, one was called The Harlem Dancer and one was called The Invocation. In these sonnets, he discussed the social and political forms that were practiced during this time, as well as the injustices that African Americans faced throughout this time period. A majority of his work was about Jamaica, his homeland, and about romance and love in his life. In the 1920s, he had an interest in communism and decided to travel to Russia and France to learn more about that. At some point in time, he came back to New York, and his interest in communism soon died off, and he decided to convert to Catholicism. Soon he set the tone for the Harlem Renaissance and gained lots of respect from many young poets of the time, many young writers of the time. He set the tone for them, including famous writers like today, Langston Hughes.
So visual art was a very important component of the rich cultural development that took place during the Harlem Renaissance. Many artists sought to capture the reality of Harlem life as an African American, and from the 1980s to the mid 30s, numerous black artists emerged, including Augusta Savage, James Van Der Zee, Jacob Lawrence, and Louis Mylou Jones, just to name a few. The themes that they explored were black identity, the effects of slavery, and how to convey the experience of black Americans during that time. So Aaron Douglas was interesting to me because he has a famous painting called Into Bondage. And this painting basically shows African people in chains heading towards a ship. So it's kind of like a depiction of slavery, but in the center of the photo, there is like a beam of light that's coming towards one of the African people who are in chains. So, in my opinion, this symbolizes like the freedom and the hope for the future for African people. Because even though they were being enslaved at that moment, there was still hope for the future. That's what I see the little star as a symbol. And I also think that he made this painting as like a reminder to show the horrors of slavery so that we don't forget, because a famous quote is like, if you don't, history will repeat itself if you don't know history. So he's definitely trying to educate people about slavery, while also kind of put a positive message in this painting. Another painting that I found interesting was Augusta Savage's painting called Lift Every Voice. And Augusta Savage was interesting because she did many sculptures that took influence from African tradition. So she designed African style masks, and in 1938 she painted Les Fieches, which depicts masks in 5 different ethnic styles. So that was she's a very interesting artist because she takes from her African roots, which is something that wasn't very popular back then, and it's still not popular today. So it's very commendable that she took art and took inspiration from Africa. And these are just a few of the many artists who were around during the Harlem Renaissance, and their effects can still be seen today by the many different black artists, musicians, and writers that we see today. Many of them wouldn't be here if it weren't for the influences that were made during the Harlem Renaissance.